Okay, thank you very much indeed, Francis. That was a wonderful video, an excellent presentation, as we all expected. Can you all hear me, by the way? Because I can't actually see there we are. Okay, I see all of you. Hello there, Francis. And hello, Hugh. Could I just, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, introduce you to both our guests, Francis Wood, Dr. Francis Wood, top left there, who has just given us the presentation, and Mr. Hugh Cantlie, who is the grandson of Sir James. And we're terribly honoured to have both of you. We're going to have a panel discussion for about half an hour or so, after which we'll have a Q&A when all of you will be encouraged to ask questions of our speakers. But could I please ask you to wait and ask your questions at the very end of this panel discussion? And if you would very kindly just type them up, then we can have a look at them. And if there are any overlaps, perhaps we can just choose the more representative ones. All right, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so Francis, first of all, thank you so much for that presentation. Excellent, as usual. Now, obviously, the whole incident of Sun Yat-Sen coming to London in the first place and actually being arrested here, not very many people actually know about that. It's you know, I mean, not very many people know about Chinese activities in London altogether. But can I ask you, why was it that he chose London of all places? Did he feel that he would actually get refuge here? Would there be sympathy for his cause and for him personally? Why London of all places?
I think he was basically escaping. I mean, London is a great place because he does know that he has one major and serious contact there. I mean, he arrives in Liverpool and then he comes straight to London. After that, his ship docks in Liverpool and he comes straight to London. And pretty much the first thing he does is contact Dr. Cantlie. So, you know, that's his background, you know, his training as a medical doctor. He must have felt very secure in his teacher and in, you know, the whole time that he spent learning in Hong Kong.
Now, interestingly, you know, of course, he has the great fortune of knowing the Cantlies. But Hugh, could we just go back in history a little bit and ask, how was it that your grandfather actually ended up in Guangdong in the first place and in the Far East? What took him there?
He after Charing Cross Hospital, where he learned his medicine, he went at the invitation of Dr. Manson, who was retiring, to Hong Kong to study tropical diseases, and which he did do. But then he thought that he would pass Western medicine, as you might say, to Chinese medical students. So he set up this evening class of various Chinese medical students who wanted to come and learn a bit more about Western medicine. And one of his first students, and certainly one of his brightest, was Dr. Sun Yat-Sen himself. And my grandparents, therefore, looked after him whenever he could. And when he got into trouble with the authorities up in Guangzhou, he'd come rushing down. And so I'm being looked for. And on one occasion, my grandfather managed to get him out from Hong Kong to Japan. And afterwards, one of his failed uprisings. But then there came the time when, in 1892, when Dr. Sun passed his doctorate and was officially a doctor and had to set up his own surgery in Macau. And my grandfather used to go over on Sundays to Macau to make quite sure that his student was doing the right things and prescribing the right medicines and such like. And my grandparents eventually returned to the country. And this is in accordance with my father. And they were going not the usual trip through the Suez Canal, but were going back over the Pacific. and they arrived in Hawaii, and they were going down the main street there. And there they suddenly saw Dr. Sun in a suit and his hair cut short. So they came to a halt, said, hello, how are you? Ah, hello, Dr. Miss Cantlie, how are you? What are you doing? Well, I'm still causing revolts when I can, and I'm here to see my brother. And well, if you ever come to London, we know where we live, and come and visit us. So that laid the foundation for when he came to London. He therefore went. The phone rang up and said, "Can I come over?" "By all means," said my grandmother. "But be careful of the legation. They're looking for you." Well, he obviously forgot or something, and the rest is history on that score.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in a little while. But Francis, from your research, we know that obviously Dr. Sun was a medical student, but at what point did he actually start getting interested in politics? You know, how is it that this student of medicine starts causing trouble and gets into the habit of causing revolts?
I don't know exactly, but I would suspect that having been in touch with Western medicine and Western doctors and the way they did things, he thought, well, there must be a better way of doing it in China. And he started doing this when he was, when he was still studying or when he had set up his own practice in Macau. I don't know, but this is probably to do with seeing there was a different alternative to doing things.
Francis, do you find that?
Yes, I think it's very much characteristic of southern China at that sort of time that you've got places like Hong Kong and Macau, which do give you, I mean, albeit a very imperfect view of what other systems might be. I mean, Hong Kong wasn't exactly a paradise if you were poor or anything like that. But it gives you access to other ideas. I mean, Japan is also very important. And so many of the revolutionaries or the left wing or kind of engaged people spent a lot of time in Japan because, again, it was a safe place to go. You had to get out of China if you wanted to meet up with like-minded friends and think about, planning a new newspaper, a journal, or anything like that. So there's an awful lot of movement, but it is very much characteristic of South China, of the area that he comes from.
So Dr. Sun finally comes to Britain and to London, but before he actually comes, he in fact writes to the Cantlies. You have a letter, Hugh, marked 1910, when he actually mentions to the Cantlies that he's coming over to see them. And this letter was written in Malaysia. Now, Hugo at the embassy, I don't know whether you can find that particular letter. It's marked 1910. Can you put that up on the screen? I think it's another letter. No, not this one.
That's the one.
That's the one, yes. Now let's see if I can see it. My dear, this is to Mrs. Cantlie. Your kind letter of April the 17th, addressed to the care of obviously a mutual friend. For this letter, let's see, he's only just received it because it's passed through various countries, I think, and various people. And then he says at the bottom, I'm enjoying good health here, and my family is coming to join me. Now, but he does say at one point that he's going to be visiting the Cantlies. And he does do so. And it's strange, Francis, you mentioned that, when he actually got to London, he goes from Gray's Inn, where he's staying, to Devonshire Place, which is literally just around the corner from the embassy. And yet he isn't even aware that that was the Chinese embassy, that he was actually passing this place almost, every time he went off to the Cantlies. That's quite remarkable.
It is, but on the other hand, that was presumably the practice in those days. If you didn't put up a flag and you don't put up, how on earth would he know? I mean, Mrs. Cantlie may have said the legation is looking for you, but where is the legation? I mean, there's no indication at all. He does say at one point, I think, in his kind of reminiscences of the time, that he had noticed that there were quite a lot of Chinese people hanging around on a kind of street corner, but he didn't pay any particular attention to them. And then, of course, you know, one day they're looking for him and they pull him in. But I think
so he wouldn't have made a very good spy then, would he? You know, the very fact that he notices a whole crowd of Chinese people hanging around there, but doesn't actually discover why they're hanging around there.
I don't think it was so many as a whole. I think he probably had, I mean, as we would have, a sort of false sense of security on the London streets. You know, I'm in England. You know, what could happen? How can the Chinese reach me, even if they have a legation? And I mean, as so it proved, and as we know from other stories, I mean, with other countries and other people, it's not actually that easy to smuggle a human being out of one country to another if that human being doesn't want to. You have to be someone really clever, like Philby, and, you know, I mean, a really pleasant sort of spy. In everyday terms, it's very difficult to get people across borders if they're unwilling. And I think he would, I mean, he must have, you know, if you think about how he was passing his time, he was enjoying himself. I mean, he was improving his mind. I mean, the freedom of the British Library, well, British Museum Library, everything he wanted to read, ordering books on every subject. I mean, that was wonderful. And then, you know, going around and visiting everything else. He must have felt, generally speaking, incredibly happy. Well, that's once he's got past the embassy, as it were.
We'll come back to that as well in a minute, Francis, about his wide range of reading. But just going back to his visits to the Cantlie's home in Devonshire Place, there's clearly he is under a lot of pressure. He does know that he's a wanted man and that there's a price on his head. And there's another letter, Hugo, that you managed to look to find for us in 1911, where he talks about the secrecy that is required of his movements. Let's see, it says, "My dear Dr. and Mrs. Cantlie, I'm coming to London and will see you as soon as I have settled up business. Please keep my movement strictly secret." Now that's important, isn't it? "Please keep my movement strictly secret, for it is very important to our cause. If any letters and cablegrams sent to your care for me, please keep them for my calling. With best regards, very truly yours, Y.S. Sun." So we can see there that he knows that he is possibly being followed, that his movements are being tracked, and therefore all letters to him, addressed to him, have to be sent to the Cantlies for his safekeeping, really. So when he does actually go to the Cantlies, he goes regularly, as you've mentioned, Francis, and we know this, Hugh, from this wonderful hat rack that you've managed to keep of your grandfather's. Hugo, can we see the famous hat rack?
Yes, but this again, my father said that.
There we are, yes.
Remember that hat rack, because that's where Dr. Sun always hung his hat.
Now, this is a very interesting hat rack. Hugh, can you tell us anything about this? Because you have two elephants on either side and a hat. Not Dr. Sun's hat, I hasten to add, but tell me, where does this hat rack come from?
Where did the hat rack come from?
Yes.
They're from Devonshire Street, their house there.
But originally, have you any idea where your grandfather had got that from?
He must have brought it back from Hong Kong, I think.
Well, I was just wondering whether that was the case. But this is actually quite important, because I think I have read somewhere that Dr. Sun used to use this hat rack. This is, I can't remember where I've seen it, but I have actually heard mention of this. But you have now very carefully preserved this very famous hat rack, and I hope that we shall all be able to see it one fine day. So clearly he...
My father speaking about his memories. He wasn't born until 1899, but he certainly remembered the first time he saw Dr. Sun. He'd come down to spend the weekend at the house they had in the country. And my father was very small, I don't know, 6 or something, and he suddenly saw this man standing in the orchard, deep in thought. And then he went rushing up to say, "Hello, I'm Kenneth." And then he said, "No, he is a very important man and he's very deep in thought and I mustn't disturb him." So that was his first meeting with Dr. Sun. But obviously they used to meet up when he visited in the early part of the 1900s to Devonshire Street, hence his memory of Dr. Sun putting his hat on the hat rack.
Mm. Does your father mention anything else about, he says that he was always deep in thought, Dr. Sun was always deep in thought in the orchard, but does he actually mention anything about whether or not Dr. Sun would discuss politics or the political situation in China with your grandfather?
No, he would have been put to bed by then, I would have thought.
Rightly so, I suppose.
He wouldn't know whether it was politics or... He was a great man. He exuded.
Now, Francis, you have mentioned that while he was in London, Dr. Sun went regularly to the British Library and he read very widely. You mentioned various subjects and you talk about mining, agriculture, very practical subjects, which of course you would have to be acquainted with if you're going to rule a country. You also mentioned, though, interestingly, diplomacy. Why do you think that was important?
Because,
of course,
well,
Dr. Cantlie.
Trying to, diplomacy is to understand the other person's train of thought. And all nations think slightly different from each other nation. And it's important to work out what he's thinking, or the other side, from his point of view, so that you can talk the same sort of language on the diplomatic side.
Francis, do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I mean, one of the things is that Sun Yat-Sen was very much one of the outgoing, as it were, revolutionary leaders. I mean, he was responsible for gathering funds amongst particularly overseas Chinese in America, Hawaii, Canada, and so on. And he was on the fundraising tour when the actual revolution broke out in 1911. So, I mean, he's very concerned with the outward relations of the Revolutionary Party that he's beginning to find. But I think too, I mean, I think his broad reading, he's looking to a time when it's one notch up, when he's not gathering funds for a revolutionary movement to overthrow the Qing, but he's dealing with the nations of the world, you know, on behalf of the new China that he's hoping to deal with. And yeah, I think diplomacy would have been a very important part of his makeup in terms of forward looking. You know, when he gets above the fundraising part of his life, then he's going to have to deal with other countries. And, you know, that is very much part of sort of a modern nation. You know, one of the things that the Qing government found very difficult was dealing with the outside world. I mean, they struggled and eventually set up a sort of the Zhongli Yamen, a kind of foreign office. But that's, you know, within the last decades of the Qing dynasty. Otherwise, before that, they were, you know, diplomacy as far as traditional China was concerned was operated on China's lines. You know, if you didn't ketou, if you didn't bring tribute at the right time of year, then you were rather excluded. So he's looking towards, yeah, a modern nation state attitude to the outside world.
Which is why I brought that up, because I think certainly up till then, the Chinese had been very much introspective. I mean, of course, they knew that the rest of the world did exist, but Zhongguo, the central kingdom, was very much the center of the universe. And for them, other nations would sort of bow and kowtow to them. But all of a sudden, you have this very open-minded, broad-minded person in Sun Yat-Sen looking outwards instead of purely inwards. And that, I think, is a very interesting thing indeed. What do you think he actually gained from his visit to America, to to Britain, Francis, in terms of developing his political thought?
Me, I
Well,
think.
both.
Sorry. No, I think a lot of his traveling around the world was to get funds for the cause. And he used to see the Canadian Chinese and American Chinese and also the Chinese in this country and say, we need help to bring China into the 20th century.
Francis?
Working in the library of the British Museum, I mean, what I was particularly impressed by was that he would spend 6 hours a day there, you know, and that shows reels and go many times a week. I mean, so the poor old detectives have to sit presumably outside the reading room, waiting him to go in, come out, you know, 6 hours later he returned. It's but you know, that shows enormous seriousness of study. I mean, it does take a long time sometimes to get a book in the library, but you know, if he's there for 6 hours, he'll have a great pile, and you can keep them for the next day. So I think it shows really what an enormously serious person he was, and I was terribly impressed by this breadth of his reading, you know, and the fact, of course, that he's doing it in English. You know, he's no mean scholar if he can cover all of those subjects in English. It's very impressive.
Now, in your presentation, Francis, you come to the Chinese Labour Corps and the involvement of China, albeit sort of indirectly, through the labourers in the at the front line. Now, you also mentioned that Sun Yat-Sen himself was not particularly supportive of the idea of sending labourers to the front. Why was this? What was going through his mind? I mean, given that he had already spent time in Britain, he knew the state of affairs, or sort of generally understood the situation in Europe at the time. What was it that put him against this whole idea of, you know, sending people out to the front?
So many views on the World War in China at the time. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying if you look at the changes at the top of the Chinese government during the First World War. You know, that you have a new prime minister practically every 2 weeks. I mean, there's clearly tremendous confusion as to what would be best to do. And I think for Sun Yat-Sen, he was more interested in building the nation, and really he probably did feel that, you know, a European war is a European war. He wasn't in Shandong, you know, he's from the south, he's from an area that's more used to rubbing along with imperialists. And I think he thought that it was probably, you know, a waste of money and manpower to engage very strongly with. I think he did see it much more as a European war. Not being from Shandong, I don't think he felt it so strongly. But his is only one view. You know, had so many views in China. And you had people who were willing to try and break embargoes, who were willing to do all sorts of complicated things. And of course, actually, I mean, in some ways, Sun Yat-Sen was right, because in the end, it was, in a sense, finance that wrecked the Versailles conference for China, because the government had agreed to take an enormous loan from Japan. And one of the conditions, this was one of the secret treaties, a secret treaty made with Japan for an enormous sum of money, and in return that the Chinese government at the time would forget Qingdao. So, I mean, Sun Yat-Sen, in a sense, if you look at it, was right that it was not a good idea to get embroiled in the war at that time, in a way, one can say.
Well, it's also interesting to note that another great Chinese thinker, the political reformer Kang Youwei, he had warned when advocating against China's involvement in the World War. He said, "There is no such thing as an army of righteousness which will come to the assistance of weak nations." So clearly, Kang Youwei had his suspicions as to whether or not the Western allies would finally support and reward China for her involvement, and clearly Sun Yat-Sen was against it altogether. Now, when you mentioned the Versailles Treaty, it was interesting. I don't think many people realize that there were two delegations from China who went for the Paris Peace Conference. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think you should be telling us about anything to do with the CLC and the First World War. But I mean, as much as I can say that, yes, there were two delegations from China which didn't agree. I mean, an official one and a southern one. And I think as well, one of the things that I find, one of the only things that's actually amusing about the whole Versailles horror is the Russian participation, in that the Russian government, you know, in 1917, their imperial government had been overthrown, and Trotsky goes in to become foreign minister, goes into the foreign ministry, discovers on the desk of the foreign minister all the secret treaties that have been signed between France and Great Britain and Japan, and all the dirty double dealing that's going on underneath the cover of we're all allies, we're all in it together. And he hands out the secret treaties, copies of the secret treaties, to anyone who's willing to have them. I mean, this is a kind of extraordinary opening of, and in a sense, a breaking of the old style of diplomacy, which was all about secrecy. And so you have the two Chinese delegations, a very interesting one led very much more from the south, with people like Eugene Chen in it, interesting, charismatic left-wing figures. The one to the official one, led by a man who eventually retreated to become a monk. He was so horrified by the things that he had seen. But the participation in the official delegation included very, very bright, very, very brilliant people. And they argued the case extraordinarily well, but there was no way, unfortunately, that, for example, Britain could forget the fact that she was tied in a stranglehold with Japan owing to alliances that had been signed in the early 1900s, and which Japan was merrily breaking left, right and centre. But the British thought, oh God, we've signed an alliance, we better stick to it. So it's a terribly confusing picture.
Well, of course, there was a great deal of chaos throughout the 1900s, in the early part of the 1900s, leading up eventually to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party and, of course, the People's Republic. Now, the Cantlies, in the meantime, Hugh, they do actually return to the Far East at some point, don't they? Because we've got a photograph of, let's see, you have another wonderful photograph. There we are. Yes, now tell us about this photograph.
My father was one of the first people to return to China on a business basis to represent some British firms. And he returned quite often in those days, in the early 50s. And in this particular one, and at that meeting, the Premier said, do we let Suarez and, my memory's gone, the Jardine Matheson back to trade with China? And my father said, well, they will certainly open up trading links if you let them come in. And the Premier then said, well, they will not be allowed to make so much profit in future. And that was certainly confirmed when I talked to somebody from Suarez. As you know, we used to make 30%. Now we luckily make 3%. But so that was the course of that particular conversation now.
Of course, those two companies are still very prominent in Hong Kong. But there's also another photograph. Tell us about this one.
Well, that again was on one of his business trips to China at the time, where they felt they could talk, you know, you might say, and not worry about political aspects. So that's the Hall of the Great, where he was giving a talk to celebrate the 90 years.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that even in those early days, the Chinese government was happy to allow a foreign national to stand up in front of a huge conference to speak his mind. That is interesting.
They knew that my father was not fighting, but on the Chinese side, and he was doing what he could to get China accepted by everybody at the time.
Mm. Mm. And Hugh, you yourself were born in Shanghai, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, I was born in 1932 in the country hospital during a Japanese air raid, apparently.
Mm-hmm. And where is this photograph taken? Is it actually at your home?
This was in Dafanshang Road, off Bubbling Wells Road.
Mm-hmm.
Spent the first few years of my life. Then we moved to Nanjing to the Ministry of Railways, because my father, those days, was the technical advisor to the Ministry of Railways.
Mm.
And my future godfather, Sun Yat-Sen's son. And so we lived in Nanjing until the Japanese army arrived, or until just before the Japanese army arrived with 1 day to spare.
Mm.
And I remember my mother rushing into our nursery and saying, "Boys, pack a small suitcase. We are leaving in 5 minutes." And I packed my little train set, I think, what my brother packed, I do not know, rushed downstairs, and my father in the car, my mother in front, and me threw our suitcases in, drove out of the gates and turned left away from Nanjing, which I thought was strange. Because up to that time, we used to sit outside the gates watching all these troops marching up and down the road in light blue uniforms. There weren't any troops, but there were some soldiers at the end of the street in brown uniforms. So we just got away in time. Came back on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and another memory I have is waking up in the middle of the night in a strange bedroom. And obviously, so I'm shouting for my mother, nothing happened. Then I got out of bed, walked down some stairs because there were voices at the bottom, opened the door at the bottom into a dining room with candles, and a man at the end with a wing collar, a black bow tie, and his wife, obviously, on the other end in a black dress. I remember that, and I must have wailed and saying, "I want my mother," because she then appeared into that memory. And I did ask my mother years later, "I've got this memory, where was that?" And she said, "Oh, we were staying with the Italian Consul General in Mukden the last night before we caught the Trans-Siberian back to this country." And that was 2 weeks on a train. My youngest brother nearly appeared on the train. So we had to spend 3 days in Moscow to let things settle down again. And on we went, came back, and my next big memory is arriving in Harwich Port in January 38, a bitterly cold day, raining, to be met by my father's brother and wife. And there were the 4 of us with our little suitcases. And my uncle saying, "Well, you better live with us until you got yourself sorted out." So that's the end of that journey, which was quite a long one.
Well, it must have been very exciting for you, but obviously highly turbulent times for China. And we see now, coming back to Sun Yat-Sen, we see this final photograph, Hugo, of Sun Yat-Sen's signature.
Yes.
There it is, in his own.
That's right. I don't know, it's in one of the filing cabinets. I came across that the other day. Now, is that his Chinese signature there?
Mm-hmm. No, it's, by the way, I should mention to everyone that Hugh laboriously went through 5 cabinets of correspondence and archives to try and dig out these photographs and documents for us. So we're very, very grateful indeed, Hugh. And Hugo, could we have a look at the photograph that I sent you yesterday of the Cantlies, the very end? Yes, that's the one. And that's your grandfather.
My grandfather, my grandmother.
And your grandmother.
And uniforms as St. John's Ambulance Brigade, I think, at the time.
Right.
But both of them played a very active role in the First War. On the St. John's Ambulance, Red Cross, my grandfather gave lectures on first aid to a whole lot of people, including my mother in those days, who didn't know she was going to be a Cantlie later on. And supported very ably by my grandmother. But the strain of the First War played havoc with their health thereafter, but they played an enormously important part in the medical world during the First War.
Well, not only in Britain, but they played an enormous part in rescuing Dr. Sun Yat-Sen from the Chinese legation in London. And at this point, I should just claim my small connection, albeit very indirect, to the whole Sun Yat-Sen in London story. And that is that about 20 years ago, China Central Television came over to Britain to film the British section of the Sun Yat-Sen story. And I was asked to produce that part. And it was a drama serial, so it involved actors. And I remember casting all of these actors in Britain. And I also actually remember casting actors to play your grandfather and your grandmother. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of that. But I was just looking at this photograph last night and I thought, actually, very much by accident, I did in fact manage to find an actor who looked remarkably similar. So that was rather fortuitous. But also one particular scene that I remember having that we were filming was outside these wrought iron gates, and we had assembled a crowd of people, children, adults, and also journalists with their cameras, and they were all ranting and raving, "Free Dr. Sun, free Dr. Sun." So that's my little connection with the Sun Yat-Sen story. Right, well, thank you very much indeed, both Francis and Hugh, for your excellent contributions, really very insightful and very interesting indeed. Now I'm going to open this out to our audience. If any of you have any questions, could you please type them up? Or if you find difficulty typing them, which is very possible, perhaps you can just raise your hand. Now let's see. I've got one question here from Michael Sheringham. To Francis, please. Very interesting. Is there any plaque or notice in the old British Museum library for Sun Yat-Sen?
No. Well, I think the British Museum Library prides itself. I mean, Lenin, Marx, Mr. Marx, did he ever finish the book he was writing? I mean, the difficulty is, I suppose, if you wanted to put up lists of who used the reading room, it would be just too enormous for words. And also the difficulty is that because you could never book your seat, nobody knows exactly where people sat, so you can't name the places. So sadly, no, but the records of these people are all in the archives. They, when they fill in their application for a reader's ticket. Sorry, no.
Yes.
But I think it's too difficult because you where would you start and where would you stop? Almost every scholar from all over the world had worked in the reading room at one point.
Yes, that's true. Very true. Although I have to say that I do believe that Sun Yat-Sen is memorialized in various places in Hawaii, particularly, and in North America in general, but not so much in Britain, sad to say. I mean, you have told us of a plaque that's still up there in London, but otherwise I myself am not aware of any other memorials. Brian Sitch, hello Brian. Brian is the curator of the China Gallery at the University of Manchester, and he asks, I'd like to ask what the panel makes of the suggestion that Sun Yat-Sen knew exactly what he was doing and was using the likely prospect of an incident near the Chinese embassy as a publicity stunt to promote his revolutionary credentials. Although this backfired horribly and in fact nearly got him killed, I am mindful of what happened to the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. Now that's rather interesting, isn't it? Well, let's go to Hugh first. Hugh, have you any idea, do you have any ideas about this at all?
I have been told that my grandfather actually got the whole thing set up. But that is not true. Not certainly on my grandfather. Whether there is any basis to it at all, I don't know. But I think Dr. Sun, had he done it to promote himself, he really did think he was on his way back to China in a box, coffin-shaped. So I don't think he would have done it self-promotion, but it makes it sound, but I don't think it could be true.
Francis, what do you think?
I think the problem is that, of course, there are two stories. There's Sun Yat-sen's story, and there is a story from the Chinese embassy. It was very important for the Chinese embassy to come out of this smelling sweetly, and their claim basically was that he visited the embassy several times and went willingly, and so that when he went into the embassy, they hadn't dragged him in. I mean, that's as far as their claim goes. I think if he was hoping, if he was hoping for public, he would have been barking up the wrong tree. I mean, if you've got Scotland Yard's first instinct is to say that Dr. Cantlie is mad with this story of or drunk. I mean, and I don't think England at the time was a tremendously kind of fruitful place for any particular support. It might have been easier in places like Canada or America, where you had larger and much more engaged overseas Chinese communities. I mean, I think it would have been suicidal. He knew the danger, and I think it would have been absolutely crazy. And I don't think he was that crazy. Again, I think, if you're doing that kind of thing, and when you get released, then you spend hours reading in the library. He should have been otherwise going around selling his story to everyone. I mean, there was a lot of journalistic interest, but he didn't make much of it. So I think that is a fanciful thought.
Interesting, though, nevertheless. Thank you, Brian, for that. Then we have Neil Taylor. I believe you've raised your hand. Have you a question for us? Neil Taylor?
Unmute. Yes. Hello?
Hello, Neil.
Oh, good. You can hear me. Yes. Just about Sun Yat-sen's thoughts and how he's sort of still regarded as a hero, both on Taiwan and on the mainland. If one goes back to the 50s, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, what did they have in common? Nothing except really reverence for Sun Yat-sen. So I'm tempted to say, was his thinking very woolly, that they could both respect him and revere him? Or can one say, well, he had a clear plan for how the country should be run? Are there any labels one can give him? Can one say he's left-wing, right-wing, wanted to promote a capitalist system, a socialist system? I just don't know. Is it possible to summarize his thought in any way?
Francis, would you like to answer that?
No, I don't think I'm the person to ask, really. I mean, I think he had fairly strong ideas, set out to a great deal, but I mean, what he's known for are these kind of fairly much more simple slogans. The three people's principles. I think as a figure, it's less his thought than his kind of overall idea and his activity. You know, he served to create, but he didn't. He's not like, yeah, it's not like Mao has written thousands of things down. I think he's an inspirer rather than a great thinker, and it's his inspiration and where he was and what he did and what he continued to do, and his principles are, you know, they're a bit like the kind of, you know, liberté, égalité, fraternité. They're general, that nobody could possibly, well, one wouldn't think that anyone could possibly disagree with his idea of, you know, livelihood and peace and happiness and so on. So I think he's more of a figurehead, but a very significant one. And then, of course, you do get sort of the continuity through his wife. You know, that he married a much younger woman, and she continued to work in sort of welfare and that kind of thing. She led, you know, quite an important life throughout, say, the 20s, 30s, 40s after his death. So I think I would say that he is more of a figurehead than a thinker, but a very important figurehead.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree there. I must say, I've never heard Sun Yat-Sen as being described as being woolly, but I think that certainly he was an inspiring personality, and it was really his ideals, you know, as embodied in the three principles of the people, that's nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people, that caught the imagination of the people. And it's great credit to him in the sense that he is still highly regarded both on the mainland and in Taiwan. You know, the fact that he was able to actually, in that sense, unite people across the country, I think is quite remarkable. But David Say, you've raised your hand. Oh, hold on, here we are. You've said, given the global significance of the CLC, of the Chinese Labour Corps' contribution to world history, why is there so much ignorance about the Labour Corps in both the East and the West? Francis.
No, Wenlan, you answer. You're not just a moderator. I think you're a...
No. I think people would prefer to hear from you, Francis.
No, I don't think so. It's terribly recent interest in the CLC, and I mean, I'm glad to say that now there has been a big commemoration in China. There's a massive memorial that has been constructed, and there's a tiny little memorial in London, and hopes for something better. I don't know quite why. I mean, and actually, one of the things in the recent problem about the commemoration of the soldiers from India and Africa in world wars, and the fact that the Commonwealth, the Graves Commission, hasn't looked after them properly, there is a sort of a sense of peace with the Chinese, in that there are wonderful graveyards across Belgium, and I think France as well, where Chinese graves have been placed for the CLC members. I mean, I think one of the things is that the CLC, that the people who served with the CLC, they go back to China. And of course, it's still, you know, China is not exactly in a wonderful state in the 20s. You know, they go back to the period of warlordism, of fighting across the country, of a tremendous period of difficulty and strife within China. So they're not kind of likely to kind of form a massive body of any sort. They go back to their countryside. And Wenlan has interviewed descendants and so on. You know, they go back to their quiet little life in the countryside. So they aren't particularly noisy, as it were, in China. And in Europe, well, again, I think that the assistance that people give in war is very much kind of, the commemoration is related very much to the loudness of the voices, and the Chinese were very quiet. But the graveyards are there and were pretty carefully worked on. They did, you know, carefully get Chinese characters written on the graves and so on. So there was an attempt to make, at least to commemorate them in death with some respect.
I think you're right, Francis. I mean, I think that, you know, the very fact that they were laborers, that they weren't an institution as such. There is no sort of common body representing them. And would you say also that people generally at the back, you know, sort of well away, not actually physically fighting, tend not to get remembered all that much? I mean, when you consider even people on the home front, you know, or the mappers, they are never remembered as well as the fighters, the soldiers at the front. And, you know, just speaking generally.
I think that's absolutely right. Yes, yes.
So I think in that sense, to a great extent, the labourers have very sadly been forgotten. Mark Hoskin, you have a question. You've just raised your hand. Could you unmute yourself and speak? Mark? Mark, are you here? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Your question,
Okay.
yes.
Well, it wasn't a question, it was more a comment about Dr. Sun. When he was writing about the reconstruction of China in the early 1920s, from about 1918 onwards, and within the Guangzhou government, as it was called, or the Canton government as it was called, and there were people like Mao and Zhou Enlai that were there, and that were part of the organization that became the KMT that were there. And I think it was inspirational to all sides of the political spectrum, because he was actually just talking about the fact that China needed to do something, and the reconstruction that he was proposing, like infrastructure, railways, the port system, were things that it didn't matter what your politics were, they had to be done. And he wrote about how they could be done in a way that reached back to things like, you know, the Chinese had constructed the Great Wall of China, Zheng He's voyages during the early Ming dynasty, and that those were inspirational things that showed that China as it could perform great projects and see them through and to completion. And so those were examples from the past that could be used in the future. And it didn't matter what your politics were. What mattered that you were a Chinese and you wanted to do them. And that's what, and because he seemed to be writing from that perspective, it meant that now you can have two sides of a political spectrum, if you look at them in that way, both agreeing with him, because it was very neutral.
Thank you.
Good, a very good point.
Francis, do you have anything to add to that?
I was going to say, I think it's a very good point that, you know, a pragmatist talking about things like railways can, yes, is supporting the nation, and it doesn't matter which side you come from, unless you're very against railways. But you know, I think that's a good point.
Now, I just wonder, Hugh, in reading all the documents that have been left behind by either your grandfather or your father, particularly in your father's case, do you think that he noticed any major difference between the China that his father knew, that your grandfather knew, and what he himself saw much later in the 50s? Do you have any accounts of that at all?
Well, I don't think my father went to China until about 1930 or thereabouts.
Oh, 1930, right, okay.
He went there in 1929 for the re-interment of Dr. Sun in the mausoleum in Nanjing. And there's photographs of cinefilm of him toiling up all those 340 steps, which I had to do when I was 4 years old, and it was quite a long journey, I can tell you. There's one, he went for there, and he met Sun Fu, the son of Dr. Sun, and he'd just been appointed as Ministry for Railways, and my father was a trained railway engineer. So he said, would you come and be a technical advisor for us on rebuilding the railways in China? So that's the reason why he went there. Then he married my mother then as well, and we settled in Shanghai. It
Well,
then moved to Nanjing, where he, to the Ministry of Railways, and he had to build the railway line from Guangzhou to Shanghai, which was quite sort of demanding, and he had to design a locomotive which could pull very long trains up very steep hills, run around narrow bends and over weak bridges. And one of the locomotives is now the big Chinese 484, it's called, is in the museum in York, the Railway Museum there, where it towers over all the other locomotives. So it takes prime position of Chinese railway locomotive. And in that capacity, when the Japanese got closer to Nanjing, we were advised to leave. Although we went at war with Japan at the time, but they tended to shoot you first and apologize later.
Well, of course, those railways were very important in building up the infrastructure of China, and to that extent, I think China has benefited greatly from Western technology. We know, for example, that in the recruitment of Chinese laborers from Shandong province, the railways built by the Germans at the time were instrumental in the Germans, in the British actually getting access to laborers in the hinterland. So that was rather important. David Law, I would like to ask a question about Sun and the 1922 strike. What would you like to ask, David? Very quickly, please. Would you like to speak to us? If so, could you unmute yourself? Hold on. David, have we lost him? Well, perhaps
yes,
we've lost.
hello, here I am. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, 1922 strike in Hong Kong, Siemens strike, but in fact, general strike. I think the first general strike in the British Empire. Sun Yat-Sen was not in Canton at the time, but of course his political organization was the government of Canton, and the 1922 strike could not possibly have occurred without extensive support from that government. I wonder if anyone would like to say anything about Sun Yat-sen's role in the Hong Kong general strike of 1922.
Francis, could you answer that?
I'm absolutely unqualified too. I mean, I looked particularly at Sun Yat-sen in London for this talk, and I'm fairly familiar with that very early period of his life, but insufficiently. No, I would bow to anybody else's expertise on that.
Hugh, would you know of any reference to the 1922 strike in the records of your grandfather, by any chance?
I don't know about the records of my grandfather, nor where all of them may be. I haven't got any letters from Dr. Sun from that time, and the last letters I've got is 1914. I can't comment on that one at all. So
sorry, David, I'm afraid we have no answer to your question.
Okay.
But,
I mean, I do think it's worth observing that because of Sun's international travel, he had enormous support amongst the Siemens Union. And I think there clearly was a close political association between, and the grievances of the Siemens Union were largely economic to begin with. It wasn't really an anti-imperialist strike, but no doubt there was a political affiliation between Sun and that element of Hong Kong protest.
Well, David, very interestingly, Mark Hoskin has come back to us to say that he can answer that question. So Mark, very, very quickly, please, because I'd just like to squeeze in one more question after this. Mark, please.
Certainly. And this is taken from the Foreign Office files at the time from Hong Kong and Guangzhou. The strike was about the stopping of surpluses from the customs, the Chinese maritime customs, that were being paid to Sun's government in Guangzhou. and they had been stopped because of the fall in the value of silver, and there simply weren't the surpluses that there were before. And it was greatly related to that, because what he was pointing out was essentially that the British, who had agreed to this, were beholden to Chinese labor in a way that they didn't understand, and that he could, even though militarily, because Guangzhou was under blockade at this time, he couldn't do anything militarily. He could politically and socially. And essentially what they did was shut Hong Kong down. It cost a fortune when they had that strike. And so that was his part in it that I know of, but that's the source I know it from, is the Foreign Office. That's what they believed at the time.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Mark. And one final question from David Bruff to Hugh, please. Did your family, Hugh, have or maintain any contact with Sun's widow? So we're talking about Sun Ling. Would your family have continued any contact with her at all?
Whenever my father used to go to China, he invariably had dinner with Madame Sun Ling. In fact, I went there for the centenary of her birth. We went to our house there, to the small dining room, and I said, Madame Sun must have sat there, and my father must have sat there.
I don't suppose you have any photographs that you could dig out of the 5 filing cabinets worth of documents that you have. Maybe that's for next time. But for any of you who have visited Nanjing or are about to visit Nanjing at any time in the future, you really must go to the mausoleum in the Purple Mountains. It's quite a magnificent memorial to Sun Yat-Sen in the most beautiful, idyllic setting. It really is quite astounding. And I have another little anecdote to say about that. My father actually attended the burial of Sun Yat-Sen, not the burial, it was the commemoration, the commemoration of this memorial hall being opened. And he was a Boy Scout at the time. And he could have been chosen to actually go inside the mausoleum. You know, he and various other Boy Scouts and a lot of dignitaries did obviously attend that, but he was almost selected to go inside the mausoleum. But unfortunately that day, he forgot to take his little water bottle, which was part of the uniform. And having forgotten his water bottle, he was forced to just stand outside instead. So that's my little anecdote from the family. Right, okay, I think we've come to the end of that. Thank you so much once again, Francis, for a wonderful talk, and Hugh for looking through all those documents and giving us so many wonderful little stories about your family. Thank you to our audience as well for all your wonderful questions and for listening in. I'm now going to hand over to Xue Ling and the embassy, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
1.5 hours seems too short when we, talk this much over 100 years ago. Thank you so much, Francis, Wenlan, and Hugh, and all those, raised questions. Thank you for your great contributions to the event today, and thank you for your great support to rediscover China in the UK. It is indeed an informative and thought-provoking morning. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our co-organizer, supporters, media partners, and the team behind the screen. And thank you to our special guests and friends from both UK and China, old and new. Last but not least, I want to thank my colleagues from both CNTO London and the Cultural Office of the Chinese Embassy. Thank you all for making this online event such a fruitful one. Now, the meeting will be recorded and subtitled in English and Chinese later on, and you can, watch it on our social media platforms, both Chinese and English. We hope to have your continued support
and participation in our future Rediscover China in the UK. So stay tuned and see you soon. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.